Hi, Owen. How are you today?
Hi, Alicia. I'm doing okay. I'm doing okay. Thank you.
Good.
How are
Thank
you?
you. I'm all right. Thank you very much. Thank you for joining me. And today we just want to really talk about it's the anniversary of George Floyd's death. And actually, this time last year, you wrote an article about a pastor's response, which was widely received pretty well. And it would just be really good to get your reflections a year on. So much has happened in the last year. There's been so many conversations, even in our church and beyond. So it'd be really good to get what are your personal reflections a year on?
Yeah, I mean, it's been quite a year in all sorts of different ways. We know that, and not least this way. And and so yeah, I mean, my own personal reflections when I was kind of thinking about it, I would say that um, hurt and hope are two sides of the same coin. I've found that there's been a lot of encouragement and a lot of kindness from people, a lot of compassion that I've found over this last year. But I've also just found for myself the issues that were raised, that were brought up through the death of George Floyd, just personally quite challenging. I was challenged by them as I suppose, as a black man in London. I was challenged as a father of three mixed race daughters and trying to help them in their response. Then obviously in our own church there was uh, lots and lots of different kinds of responses that have really spanned the whole year that we've been working with different people and talking to people about that. And I mean, I've described it in the first couple of months after the death of George Floyd were probably for me the most challenging times in my ministry, my pastoral ministry, as a pastor. And then probably on top of that, I've had just numerous conversations with pastors and leaders right across the country around this issue. So it has been one where there's been lots of hope, but then there's also been lots of hurt, and sometimes that hurt is from the very people you're trying to help, and sometimes the hurt and hope seem to come in the same sentence from people. So that has definitely been my part of my experience of it.
How can I just dig in a little bit more in terms of the hurt? Because I get as a black woman myself, you can sometimes live in that hurt, even though you're trying to have conversations with people and help other people or just be available for other people's questions. How have you? What do you do? Do you live in that hope or in that hurt, or what do you do exactly?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I do walk with at times pain and hurt, but I'm not sure I try not to live there. And I partly don't live there because I'm leaning into God for forgiveness. I'm leaning into God at times with repentance. I've known grace and healing on issues around race and diversity in my own life. Um, and so I've known restoration. I've known all those things, but none of those things in and of themselves completely remove pain or completely remove suffering. And sometimes what you're dealing with are, you're not just dealing with historic hurts. Sometimes you're dealing with fresh hurts, fresh wounds, fresh stuff that happens to you. And so I think it is important to have come to a place of grace in it and healing in God in it and trusting God with it. Um, and that enables you to be able to manage these things going forward. But I'm not sure if I ever expect a time of absolute freedom and complete, no problems anymore. I'm not sure I expect that, because life is full of moments of challenge and suffering and stuff. And so what I what I think I have through that is an awareness of the presence of God, an awareness of the sovereignty of God over all things. And those two things, knowing his presence and knowing his sovereignty, help me manage my hurt, and also are part of what give me hope. So
That's great. That's great to hear. One of the gifts that God has given us is the church, and you are the leader of Beacon Church. And as you were saying earlier, you've spoken to other people in different churches. Is there more that the church can do, that churches can do?
yeah, I mean, I think it's probably worth mentioning again, just over this last year, one of the things that I've noticed is I've noticed people get tired and weary, and I've noticed that right across, whether it's leaders or people in churches, different people within different churches. I'm noticing people do get a bit weary and a bit tired around these issues. And I've had conversations with people where they've felt that. At times I've wondered, oh man, how are we going to really get through on this when people clearly are tired, they're weary, they're a bit confused, and they're a bit fed up. But I also just believe God has brought all these things to the surface. I personally believe God has brought things to the surface for the purpose of healing, and for the purpose of restoration, and for the purpose of reconciliation. And that if we look to him, if we trust him, we can get through those things. And obviously the Bible tells us to bring our burdens to him. And so where this is a burden, we are to bring it to him. So there's that. But directly to your question, I wanted to say that because I think that's our reality, I think. But your question, is there more the church can do? Is that the question you're asking?
How can the church support those that have hurt, and that you said, like, the hurt and hope are the same side of a coin. So in one person you can have both. How does a church deal with these issues? What more do you think the church can do to respond to these issues?
Yeah, I mean, more than ever before, what I've noticed is that the church is not an island. The church doesn't exist on its own, surrounded by blue seas, calm blue seas, doing its own thing. That is not the church. The church is like in the middle of a storm. It's like in the middle of a battle, and things that go on outside the church impact the church. I've noticed that probably more than ever before over this last year, the way in which these issues have impacted both inside the church and outside the church. But the church, and therefore that influence can be quite difficult, because sometimes you can't distinguish between what's going on, what's the church response here to what's actually going on around us. What is it? And so sometimes I think the church hasn't found its unique voice in the issue. I think our unique voice, though, is the message of reconciliation. That's what I think our unique voice is. And it's not just that we are reconciled to God through Christ, but that we're reconciled to one another through Christ. And I just wonder whether we haven't preached that message enough in our churches, so we don't create an expectation in people that they can be reconciled. That we more create an expectation that people will just live through things without believing that they come to a place of real reconciliation and peace in relationships. And so I think the church can do more around reconciliation.
Okay, that's good. And then what does reconciliation really look like? So you were explaining that we normally preach reconciliation to God, but what does reconciliation to others, what does that even look like?
Well, it's interesting because I think it means that we actually engage in like personal relationship conversations. I think it means that we preach with an expectation that God can heal divisions, that God can bring peace in relationships, and that God can bring, I suppose, comfort and security with one another, and that can be centered around Christ. I think there is something. I think there's something about learning to accept people who are different. I think there's something about, just fundamentally accepting people who are different to us, and beginning to understand our differences and almost appreciate our differences, but that needing to become almost a primary focus, rather than a kind of a side issue while we're carrying on with what we think is church. We try and do these things. I almost feel like these things are primary for the church, to be embracing our differences at the cross, to be bringing one another to the cross. I think that's probably more primary than we realize for the church.
I mean, we probably learned in the last year that none of these things are easy. It's not being a human being right now is not easy. So what hope is there?
I mean, I see hope on two levels. First of all, I just see the hope of the gospel. I do see. So although there might not be many voices saying it right now, I am persuaded that the Bible points to reconciliation with people through the gospel, and I am persuaded that if we are to preach that more and more, we will see churches change, and we will see relationships more reconciled, and we will deal with some of the issues that we've been facing over this last year. But also that on a very practical level, after George Floyd died last year, I think within a month or so, I had received a call from a fellow pastor in Liverpool, and a friend of mine had also received a call from that pastor, and the three of us began a conversation around what does it mean for us to have relationships that are more reconciled in the church and communities that are more integrated. And we began that conversation, just really talking around it, praying around it. We just did a meeting around it, where with churches that were in the north. And since then, and particularly since the beginning of this year, we've been gathering a group of church leaders and other leaders, where we've been looking at this idea of just the reconciled church, and how can we become more reconciled in our relationships and more integrated in our communities. And that has been such a blessing and such an encouragement to me. We've got churches represented there from just right across the country, who are very, I suppose, keen to work together on understanding these issues better. And it's been a real encouragement, and it's growing. It's a growing thing. It's not something that I'm fighting to kind of bring out. I think it is beginning to come out in different places. So that gives me hope, and that has really come directly out of what has happened. We weren't doing that before. We weren't talking about the reconciled church, though it's there in scripture. We weren't talking about it in that kind of way. And so I'm trusting that God is in that, and that he is leading that group through. And we've got all sorts of ideas and plans for things that we might do, whether it's working on issues around pastoral responses, as well as just wanting to help churches raise leaders who are not like them. There are all sorts of things that we're wanting to do as a group together. So that is something that is a
I mean, yeah, that sounds amazing. I think like many people will be thinking, what were their thoughts a year ago today, and just kind of working through that pain, but also beginning to see different seeds of hope and things changing. And it just feels like God has work for us to do, and being reconciled together is God's work and is what he wants us to be. So it's very exciting to be on this journey of having a church that is truly reconciled, not just to Christ, but to one another, just the way God had planned it. So that is hopeful. So thank you for talking to me today about your reflections, and Thanks.
That's okay. It's been nice to do it, and it is a genuine. There are reasons to be hopeful for the future. It's not been easy, but there are definitely reasons to be hopeful for the future. And in that sense, I'm excited for it.
Thank you.